The day my husband handed my gold jewelry to his sister without asking me, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I just stood there, frozen, watching my bangles slide from his hands into hers, catching the light for a second before disappearing into her bag like they had never belonged to me. Everyone in the room acted as if it was normal, as if something inside me hadn't just cracked. His sister smiled, that polite, thin smile people use when they think they've already won. My husband avoided my eyes, and I stayed silent, because sometimes silence feels safer than speaking when you already know no one wants to hear you. Those gold pieces weren't just jewelry. They were the last thing my mother pressed into my hands before my wedding, her palms rough from years of work, her eyes shining with pride and fear mixed together. She told me gold was a woman's security, something no one could take from her if the world turned cruel. I remembered those words as my sister-in-law thanked my husband, not me, and walked away as if she had borrowed a pen, not taken away my dignity. Later that night, when we were alone, I asked him softly why he hadn't told me. He said it wasn't a big deal. He said his sister needed it more. He said I was overthinking, that family helps family. I nodded, even though something in my chest burned. I had learned early in my marriage that asking too many questions made me difficult. So I swallowed my anger and told myself I would let it go. I told myself this was what good wives did. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. When I married Arjun, everyone said I was lucky. He was educated, well-spoken, respected in his job. His family lived comfortably, not extravagantly, but with enough stability that people envied them. At first, his sister Mira treated me warmly. She called me Babhai with a sweetness that made me feel included. But slowly, things shifted. Comments disguised as jokes. Requests that felt more like expectations. Little reminders that I was an outsider who had married into their world, not built it. The jewelry incident changed something fundamental. After that, decisions about me were made without me. My salary was temporarily needed for household expenses. My opinions were not practical. My discomfort was drama. Every time I tried to speak, I was told I was too sensitive, so I went quiet. Silence became my shield. I watched, I listened, I learned. If you want the full truth, hit like, so this story reaches more people. Days passed, then weeks. Mira started wearing my gold openly. At family gatherings, people admired her bangles, the same ones my mother had chosen with such care. No one asked me how I felt. They asked me to smile for photos. I did. Inside, I felt invisible. But something else was growing quietly alongside my pain, clarity. I began to see patterns I had ignored before. How my husband never said no to his family, but always found a reason to say no to me. How my silence was convenient for everyone, except myself. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Mira was on the phone, laughing, talking about selling some old gold to invest in something better. She mentioned my bangles casually, like they were hers by right. My hands shook as I stood there unseen, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid it would give me away. That was the moment I understood something important. If I didn't protect myself, no one else would. I didn't confront her. I didn't confront my husband either. Instead, I started preparing. Quietly, carefully. I went through old documents. I noted expenses. I paid attention to how money moved in our household and who benefited from it. Every night, I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, planning. Silence, I realized, could also be a weapon. At work, I took on extra responsibilities. I saved aggressively, opening an account only I had access to. I rebuilt connections I had let fade after marriage. Friends, colleagues, even relatives I had avoided because I didn't want to complain. I wasn't complaining anymore. I was gathering strength. My husband noticed the changes, but he misread them. He thought I had finally adjusted, finally become the easy wife his family wanted. He didn't notice the way my questions had changed, how they were fewer but sharper. He didn't see how carefully I observed him when money came up, or how I remembered everything he assumed I would forget. Then came the family function that changed everything. Mira arrived wearing my full jewelry set, not just the bangles this time. Necklace, earrings, everything. She walked in like a queen, soaking in admiration. Someone joked that she looked more like a bride than a sister. Everyone laughed. My husband laughed too. I didn't. I felt calm, strangely calm, as if something inside me had finally settled into place. That night, after everyone had left, I asked my husband one simple question. "Do you remember what you promised me before we got married?" He looked confused, irritated. He said promises were childish things people said before real life began. That answer told me everything I needed to know. I went to bed that night knowing I wouldn't be silent forever. Silence had taught me enough. It was time to decide when and how to break it. And when I finally did, it wouldn't be with tears or shouting. It would be with truth, delivered at the moment it could no longer be ignored. I slept very little that night. Not because I was angry, but because my mind was strangely alert, replaying moments from the past few years with a clarity I had never allowed myself before. Every dismissive smile, every time my needs were postponed, every joke that landed just a little too sharply. I realized that my silence hadn't kept the peace the way I thought it had. It had only taught them that my boundaries were flexible, negotiable, disposable. The next morning, life continued as usual. Tea boiled, phones rang, doors opened and closed. Mira left early, her bangles clinking softly as she adjusted her purse. My husband skimmed the newspaper, barely looking at me. Everything looked normal from the outside, and that was the most unsettling part. I understood then how easily women disappear inside ordinary routines. I went to work and did my job well, better than usual. Focus was easy when you had a purpose. During lunch, I met an old colleague I hadn't seen in years. We talked about work, about how life had changed after marriage. I didn't unload my pain, but I didn't hide either. I simply stated facts. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that stayed with me. "You know, silence is only powerful when it's chosen. Otherwise, it's just enforced." That sentence followed me home. Over the next few days, small tests came up. My husband asked casually if I had noticed some extra expenses on the credit card. I told him yes, I had. I told him exactly where they came from. He looked surprised, then defensive. He said it was nothing to worry about. I smiled and said I trusted him. That smile unsettled him more than anger ever had. Mira called one evening, asking if she could borrow another piece of jewelry for an upcoming event. The word borrow hung in the air between us. I paused, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then I said I'd think about it. She laughed nervously and said I was becoming funny these days. I laughed too. On the inside, I was counting. What my husband didn't realize was that I had started documenting everything. Dates, conversations, transactions. Not because I wanted to trap anyone, but because I wanted clarity. When people gaslight you long enough, facts become your anchor. I needed mine solid. At another family gathering, someone commented on how calm I always seemed, how understanding. "She never argues," my mother-in-law said approvingly, as if it were my greatest achievement. I met her eyes and nodded. Understanding, I had learned, was a word people used when they benefited from your restraint. That evening, as we drove home, my husband asked if something was wrong. I said no. He pressed. I said I was just tired. He accepted that easily. He always accepted my silence more readily than my words. But silence has a shelf life. I started having quiet conversations with myself, asking questions I had avoided before. What would my life look like if nothing changed? How long could I continue shrinking without losing myself completely? And the hardest question of all, what was I afraid of? The answer surprised me. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being seen as the villain. Afraid that if I spoke up, I would be labeled ungrateful, dramatic, selfish. Afraid that my truth would make others uncomfortable. Once I named that fear, it lost some of its power. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, I found the receipt for my gold jewelry. My mother's handwriting was still on the envelope, neat and careful. My throat tightened. That gold was never just about money. It was about agency, about having something that was mine, unquestionably. I realized that giving it away without my consent wasn't a mistake. It was a message. I decided then that my response would also be a message. I didn't rush. I waited for the right moment because timing matters. People dismiss emotional reactions, but they struggle to dismiss calm, prepared ones. I watched how my husband spoke about finances with his family, how he avoided specifics with me. I noticed how decisions were framed as already made, not open for discussion. I learned the language of power inside my own home. Comment respect if you believe she deserved justice. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. My husband mentioned, almost casually, that he and Mira were planning a small investment together. He said it was just an idea, nothing serious. He didn't ask for my opinion. He didn't even look at me when he said it. Something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't about jewelry anymore. This was about my erasure. I asked him where the initial money would come from. He hesitated, then said we would manage. That word again. We, a collective that never included my consent. I asked if he had already committed to it. He said it was practically done. I nodded, the calmness in my voice surprising even me. That night, I sat alone and reviewed everything I had gathered. Not with anger, but with clarity. I wasn't planning a dramatic confrontation. I was planning a conversation that would change the rules. I realized something important in that quiet hour. I didn't want revenge. I wanted balance. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted my voice back. And if the people around me couldn't handle that, then the problem wasn't my tone. It was their entitlement. The next morning, I woke up lighter. The decision had been made. Silence had served its purpose. It had shown me exactly who everyone was when they thought I wouldn't speak. And that knowledge was more valuable than any piece of gold. Soon, very soon, I would speak. Not to beg, not to accuse, but to draw a line so clear that crossing it would no longer be possible without consequences. The day I decided to speak, I didn't announce it. There was no dramatic build-up, no rehearsed speech in front of the mirror. I went about my routine as usual because I had learned that the most powerful shifts often happen quietly. I made breakfast, answered emails, watered the plants on the balcony. My husband glanced at me a few times as if sensing something had changed, but he didn't ask. He rarely did unless it benefited him. That evening, he told me his parents were coming over the next day to discuss finances. The way he said it made it clear the plan was already set. I nodded, as I always had, but inside I felt steady, not small. I realized then how much energy I had wasted over the years trying to be agreeable, thinking it would protect me. All it had done was teach others how far they could go. The next day, everyone gathered in the living room. Tea was served. Polite conversation filled the air. Mira sat across from me, my gold bangles visible on her wrists, catching the light again. She smiled at me, that same confident smile. This time it didn't hurt. It clarified. My husband began explaining the investment plan, speaking quickly, confidently, as if expecting agreement by default. My father-in-law nodded along. My mother-in-law asked practical questions. No one looked at me. I let him finish. I let the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. Then I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said I had some questions. My husband looked irritated, but he gestured for me to continue, likely assuming I'd ask something minor. I asked where the initial capital was coming from. He repeated what he'd said before, vaguely. I asked again calmly, and this time added numbers, exact figures, dates, sources. The room shifted. People leaned forward. Mira stopped smiling. I explained that I had gone through our accounts, that I was aware of where money had been moved and when, that I knew which decisions had been made without my knowledge. I wasn't emotional. I was precise. That precision made them uncomfortable. My husband interrupted me, telling me this wasn't the right time. I said it was exactly the right time, because decisions about shared finances shouldn't be surprises. My mother-in-law frowned and said I was being disrespectful. I asked her how. By asking questions? By wanting clarity about money that affected my life too. For the first time, no one answered immediately. Then I addressed the jewelry. I said it plainly, that my gold had been given away without my consent, that it had sentimental and financial value, that I had chosen to stay silent at the time, but silence didn't mean agreement. Mira laughed awkwardly and said it was temporary. I asked her when she planned to return it. She looked at my husband. He looked at the floor. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once. I could feel the tension tightening, but I didn't stop. I explained that I had documentation, receipts, bank statements, notes, not as threats but as proof that I wasn't confused, emotional, or mistaken. proof that my concerns were grounded in facts, not feelings. That distinction mattered to them, and I knew it. My father-in-law finally spoke, saying these things could be discussed privately. I agreed, but pointed out that decisions had been made publicly without me. Fairness, I said, worked both ways. My husband's face was flushed now. He asked why I was doing this. I told him the truth. Because I had learned that being quiet didn't protect me. Because I didn't want to wake up one day and realize I had lived my entire life on someone else's terms. Because I deserved a say in what happened to my time, my money, my belongings, my future. There was a long pause. In that pause, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not anger, just relief. I had finally said the words I'd been swallowing for years. The conversation didn't end neatly. Voices were raised. Accusations were made. I was called selfish, dramatic, influenced. I listened because listening no longer cost me my voice. When they finished, I said one last thing, that I wasn't asking for permission. I was stating boundaries, that from now on, no financial decisions involving me would be made without me, that my jewelry would be returned, that if these conditions weren't respected, I would make different choices for myself. I didn't specify what those choices were. I didn't have to. The seriousness in my tone said enough. That night, after everyone left, my husband confronted me. He said I had embarrassed him. I said I had protected myself. He said families don't work like that. I said maybe that was the problem. He asked if I was threatening him. I told him no, I was informing him. For the first time in our marriage, he didn't know how to respond. I went to bed feeling exhausted but clear. Speaking up hadn't solved everything. I knew that, but it had changed the dynamic. Silence had taught me how little space I was given. Speaking had shown me how much I could claim. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized something else. Whatever happened next, I would handle it with my eyes open. No more shrinking. No more disappearing inside other people's expectations. If my voice made others uncomfortable, that discomfort was no longer my responsibility to manage. The days after that conversation felt heavier than anything that had come before. Not because I regretted speaking, but because clarity has a way of stripping away comforting illusions. The house was quieter, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the tense sort where every sound feels deliberate. My husband spoke less. When he did, his words were careful, measured, as if he were learning a new language and wasn't sure which ones might trigger another shift in power. Mira didn't come around for a while. When she finally did, she wore different jewelry. That detail alone told me more than any apology could have. My gold hadn't been returned yet, but the absence was a message. Things were no longer as simple as taking from me and moving on. My mother-in-law called one afternoon, her tone unusually soft. She said families sometimes misunderstand each other, that women should adjust for the greater good. I listened patiently and then told her I agreed. Families do misunderstand each other, which is why communication matters. I added that adjustment should never mean erasure. There was a pause on the line. Then she said she'd call back later. She didn't. At night, my husband and I lay on opposite sides of the bed, both awake, both pretending to sleep. I wondered what he was thinking. Whether he was angry, confused, resentful, or simply surprised that the woman he married had grown a spine he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, his emotions weren't my responsibility to manage. A week later, he brought up the jewelry himself. He said Mira would return it soon. He said it like a concession, as if he were giving me something rather than restoring what was already mine. I thanked him without enthusiasm. Gratitude, I had learned, should not be demanded for basic respect. When the jewelry came back, it arrived in a plain cloth bag, not the box it had been taken in. I opened it slowly, checking each piece, half expecting something to be missing. Everything was there. As I held the bangles, their familiar weight grounding me, I felt something unexpected. Sadness. Not relief, not victory, but grief for how much had been taken before I even realized it was happening. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Boundaries don't magically transform people, they reveal them. My husband tried in his own way to adjust. He asked more questions. He included me in discussions. But sometimes, in moments of frustration, his old resentment slipped through. He accused me of changing, of becoming cold. I told him I had changed. Growth often looks like coldness to those who benefited from your warmth. One evening, we argued about something small, a purchase I wanted to make. He questioned whether it was necessary. I asked him why necessity was only a concern when I spent money. The question hung between us. He didn't have an answer. That silence was different from mine. It was the silence of someone confronted with their own reflection. I started spending more time outside the house, not to escape, but to expand. I met friends for coffee. I took walks alone. I enrolled in a short course I had always postponed because it didn't fit neatly into my role as a wife. Each small choice reinforced the same truth. My life didn't begin and end at home. My family noticed the change too. When I visited my parents, my mother looked at me for a long moment and said, "You seem steadier." I smiled and told her I felt that way too. I didn't tell her everything. Some truths are shared best when they've fully settled. But I silently thanked her for the gold she had given me, not just the metal, but the lesson embedded in it. One night, my husband asked me if I was thinking of leaving him. The question startled me, not because it was outrageous, but because it revealed his fear. I told him the truth. I said I was thinking of staying in a way that didn't cost me myself, that whether we stayed together or not depended on whether he could accept a partnership rather than ownership. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. He said he didn't know how to change overnight. I told him I wasn't asking for overnight. I was asking for intention, effort, accountability, the basics we should have started with. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding. As weeks turned into months, things settled into a new normal. Not perfect, but more honest. My husband stumbled sometimes, reverting to old habits, but now I pointed them out. Calmly, consistently. Each time I did, I felt less afraid. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Boundaries bring clarity, even when that clarity is uncomfortable. Mira remained distant. When we spoke, it was polite, restrained. I didn't seek reconciliation. I wasn't interested in surface harmony anymore. If respect came, it would be real or it wouldn't come at all. What surprised me most was how my silence, once broken, continued to work for me in a different way. I no longer explained myself excessively. I didn't justify every decision. I spoke when it mattered and stayed quiet when words would only dilute my point. That balance felt powerful. I realized then that the moment my husband gave away my jewelry wasn't the moment I lost something. It was the moment I began to see. See how easily women's boundaries are crossed in the name of family. See how silence is often mistaken for consent. See how strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. The gold now rests in my cupboard again, exactly where it belongs. But the real security isn't locked away in metal. It lives in the knowledge that I can speak, that I can choose, that I can walk away from any situation that requires me to shrink to survive. I don't know what the future holds. Relationships evolve or end. People grow together or apart. But I know this: I will never again confuse silence with peace. Peace requires honesty, and honesty, once claimed, is not something you can easily give back. Time has a way of revealing what confrontation cannot. As months passed, the sharpness of that initial conflict dulled, but its lessons stayed vivid. I noticed how people adjusted when they realized I would no longer absorb discomfort for the sake of harmony. Conversations became more deliberate. Decisions slowed down. I was consulted more often, not always willingly, but consistently. That alone told me my voice had weight now. Still, there were moments when the old patterns tried to return, especially during stress. One evening, my husband came home visibly frustrated from work. He complained about pressure, about expectations, about how everything felt like it was closing in on him. I listened, genuinely this time, because empathy no longer felt like a trap. Then, almost casually, he suggested postponing something important to me, a plan I had been clear about for weeks. He spoke as if it were obvious that my needs would take second place. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind him of past mistakes. I simply said no, not now, not like this. The word hung in the air, firm and final. He looked surprised, then irritated. He asked why I was being inflexible. I told him flexibility was mutual, not automatic. That was a new concept for him, and I could see him grappling with it in real time. Later that night, I thought about how many times women are told they're strong for enduring, but rarely praised for refusing. Endurance is celebrated because it keeps systems comfortable. Refusal disrupts them. I realized that my silence had once made me admirable in their eyes, but speaking had made me real in my own. I also noticed changes within myself that had nothing to do with my marriage. I trusted my instincts more. I stopped second-guessing my reactions. When something felt wrong, I no longer rushed to rationalize it away. That internal shift was subtle but profound. Confidence doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles in quietly, like a steady heartbeat you can finally hear. My husband tried in uneven ways to meet me where I was. He read articles. He asked questions that sounded rehearsed but sincere. He apologized not once but several times, each apology slightly better than the last. I didn't rush to accept them fully. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not a favor to be granted hastily. It was a process that required consistency, not words. One afternoon, we sat together going over finances, something that used to make me anxious. This time I felt calm. We discussed numbers openly. He asked for my input before making suggestions. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I realized then that the real shift wasn't in his behavior alone. It was in my willingness to walk away from discussions that didn't respect me. That possibility, unspoken but present, changed everything. Friends began to confide in me more. They told me about their own quiet compromises, their swallowed words, their misplaced guilt. I listened, recognizing parts of myself in their stories. I didn't tell them what to do. I just shared what I had learned. That silence can be a choice, but it should never be a prison. One friend asked me if I regretted not reacting immediately when my jewelry was taken. The question lingered. I thought about it carefully before answering. No, I didn't regret it. My silence had given me time to understand the full picture, to act with intention rather than impulse. But I also knew that silence without awareness can become self-betrayal. The difference lies in whether you're waiting or disappearing. There were still days when doubt crept in. Days when I wondered if things would have been easier if I had stayed quiet, smiled more, asked less. Those thoughts usually surfaced when things felt tense or uncertain. But each time, I reminded myself of how suffocating that ease had been. Comfort that costs you your voice is not comfort. It's control wearing a pleasant mask. If this shocked you, comment truth below. One evening, as I was putting my jewelry away, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, perhaps, but also clearer. My eyes held something they hadn't before: certainty. Not about outcomes, but about my worth. That certainty was something no one could take without my permission. My husband walked in and watched me quietly for a moment. He said I seemed different, more sure of myself. I asked him if that bothered him. He hesitated, then admitted it scared him sometimes. I appreciated his honesty. Change can be frightening, especially when it shifts power dynamics you never questioned before. I told him something I hadn't said out loud yet, that my silence wasn't weakness and my voice wasn't rebellion. Both were tools, and I would use them as I saw fit for my own well-being. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing something new and uncomfortable. I don't know what the future will bring for us. Maybe we'll continue to grow together. Maybe our paths will eventually diverge. What I do know is that I will no longer negotiate my self-respect. That line, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed without consequence. The gold jewelry sits quietly now, no longer a symbol of loss, but of awakening. It reminds me that sometimes what's taken from us reveals what we were missing all along: the courage to reclaim ourselves. The shift didn't announce itself with fireworks or apologies that fixed everything at once. It arrived quietly, in the way my days began to feel lighter, in the way my shoulders no longer tensed every time a decision was discussed. I realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in my marriage, but in how I occupied space in the world. I no longer felt like I was asking for permission to exist. There were still difficult conversations. There were moments when my husband slipped into old habits, speaking over me or assuming agreement. But now I stopped him, not angrily, not defensively. I simply reminded him that assumptions were part of the problem. Sometimes he corrected himself. Sometimes he didn't. What mattered was that I no longer stayed silent when it happened. One evening, he admitted something I hadn't expected. He said he had never thought about jewelry, money, or decisions the way I did because he had never needed to. Things had always worked out in his favor. He said losing that comfort scared him. I listened carefully and then told him that fairness often feels like loss to those who benefited from imbalance. He didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly. I started to notice how often women around me apologized unnecessarily. For speaking, for taking time, for wanting more. I caught myself almost doing it too, old reflexes rising automatically. Each time I stopped, I replaced apologies with pauses, with statements, with questions that didn't soften themselves to be easier to swallow. One day, Mira called me unexpectedly. She spoke awkwardly, saying she hadn't realized how important the jewelry was to me. The apology wasn't perfect. It skirted responsibility, but it was something. I thanked her without reopening old wounds. Closure, I had learned, doesn't always require full acknowledgement. Sometimes it's enough to know you're no longer vulnerable. As months turned into a year, the story of the jewelry became something else entirely. It stopped being about gold. It became the moment I learned to trust myself. The moment I understood that silence can be strategic, but only when paired with awareness and choice. Otherwise, it becomes surrender disguised as peace. There were days I wondered how different my life might have been if I had learned this lesson earlier. But regret didn't linger. Every experience had shaped me, even the painful ones. Especially the painful ones. They had taught me what I could endure and, more importantly, what I no longer needed to. My husband and I are still together. Not because I stayed silent, but because I chose to speak and he chose, imperfectly, to listen. Our relationship is quieter now, but also more real. I no longer feel like a guest in my own life. I feel like a participant. Sometimes, when I open my cupboard and see the gold resting there, I smile. Not because it's valuable, but because it no longer defines my security. My security lives in my voice, my choices, my willingness to walk away from anything that requires me to disappear. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to this to understand, it's this. Silence is not strength by default. Strength is knowing when to be silent and when to speak, and never letting anyone confuse your quiet with consent. In the end, I didn't stay silent because I was weak. I stayed silent because I was learning. And when I finally spoke, it wasn't an explosion. It was a line drawn so clearly that it changed everything that came after. If this story resonated with you, like this video so more people hear the full truth. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? And subscribe, because stories like this matter, and no one should feel alone while learning how to reclaim their voice.